Welcome to another episode of Rediscovering Conservatism, a webcast series that is jointly sponsored by New Direction and Fundación Civismo, where we engage with some of the freshest thinking on the right across Europe. And today we are very pleased to be joined by Professor Ryszard Legutko, who is obviously the co-chairman of the ECR group in the European Parliament and also the head of the Law and Justice Party delegation there in Strasbourg and Brussels. But also, just as importantly, Professor Legutko is an acclaimed philosopher and political theorist. He taught for many years at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, where he is currently tuning in from. And he has authored a wide range of philosophical texts on Socrates, Plato, and the notions of liberty, toleration, and a range of other fascinating topics. And Professor Legutko is also perhaps best known as a writer for authoring in 2016 The Demon and Democracy, which is a book that was widely read on both sides of the pond. But he has also more recently authored a forthcoming title that will also be published with Encounter Books at the start of, I believe, next year, right, 2021. The book is called The Cunning of Freedom, Saving the Self in an Age of False Idols. And we very much look forward over the course of the hour today to discuss both titles and how Professor Legutko sees the arguments in both books applying to our current predicament across the West. But I really want to start, Professor, here with The Demon and Democracy, because that was a very impactful book for a lot of people. But maybe for folks who perhaps didn't get a chance to read it or who will get a chance to read it upon watching us, you argue that far from being polar opposites, the communist Soviet totalitarian system that you lived under for so many years and the liberal democratic system that replaced it aren't really polar opposites. They actually have a lot more in common than the majority of people think. So could you maybe walk us through your thought processes and some of the arguments that you develop in the book?
Yes, well, thank you for having me on the show, and I'm delighted to be here and to talk about very important things. Yes, indeed, the thesis of the book was rather shocking to many. I mean, how can you say something so outlandish that the liberal democracy, which is a system of freedom and equality, how can you say that it's not much different from authoritarian or totalitarian communism? Well, I do not negate that there are important differences. Thanks God, there are differences. But what worries me is that there are so many similarities, and the argument in the book is rather complex. But to make it short, as concise and possible, what worries me here in liberal democracy, both in my country and in Europe, particularly in the European Union, is the omnipresence of politics. Everything is political. Everything has to be liberal democratic. Every institution, every nook and cranny of social life, and that resembles communism. Reminded me of communism, because in the communism, under the communist system, everything had to be communist. There was no society but a communist or socialist, as we used to say, society, no art but socialist art, not morality but socialist morality, no family but socialist family. And here, everything has to be liberal democratic, right? From kindergarten, from cradle to tomb, every aspect of life, right? Even the churches, even the institutions that are inherently or should be inherently non-liberal and non-democratic, such as education, right? School, school is essentially asymmetric because there are those who teach and there are those who are being taught. Or family. Family is not an egalitarian institution, it's an authoritarian institution. Or the churches, right? The church is also an authoritarian institution and should be authoritarian institution. So I'm worrying that everything tends to be liberal democratic, which means that everything tends to work according to the same mechanism, and people are more and more alike. And there is this cacophony of the same slogans, the same associations, the same rhetoric everywhere. It's so unpleasant because you feel that the atmosphere is stuffy. You cannot, hence the phenomenon on political correctness, that you cannot dissent from what people believe to be the obvious, right? Orthodoxy. You cannot be different because immediately you are an enemy. You have to be condemned, right? Or ostracized, or even punished, as the case may be. So yes, it's Europe more and more tends to be like this. And it's become institutionalized. If you look at the European Union, it's political correctness institutionalized. Yeah.
This is a fascinating point to start off, Professor, and I'm really glad that you started off just drawing this very visible comparison between two systems where, albeit they're notionally different in their orientation, the ideology that underpins both permeates life. And that's such an important point to make. And then you were arguing that it isn't just about the omnipresence of ideology, it's also that liberal democracy has a way of inflicting penalties on those who veer off from political correctness, as you were just arguing, right? And I'd like to try to bring this down to the level of the dynamics and the politics of the EU. You obviously juggled your work as an academic with serving in the European Parliament, where you're the co-chairman of the ECR group. And I wanted to see if you could maybe comment a little bit on something that we've been increasingly witness to in the EU, which is the notion of culture wars around things such as, for instance, your own country's outlook on social issues, right? The socially conservative outlook of the current Polish government. We've seen that with the recent constitutional ruling around abortion access and things of that nature. So I wonder if you could maybe, culture wars were certainly something that, as Europeans, we never expected the EU would advance or pick up on. So could you maybe kind of relate that to the EU specifically?
Yes, the European Union indeed has become the major actor in this war, right? And it's become increasingly partisan, has this one aggressive ideology. I think the reason is, or part of the reason is that what we have been observing in Europe for some time is the disappearance of conservatism as a political force. And now, if you look at the political landscape, so to speak, in today's Europe, particularly in the European Union, you can see that there's not much difference between the left-wing parties and the right-wing parties. Germany and France are perhaps the best illustration of that, but not only these countries. So if you look at German Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, apart from the fact that they are members of the same coalition, right? You do not see much of a difference. So I think after 1968, speaking symbolically, Europe has shifted, tremendously shifted to the left, and the conservatives have capitulated. The European People's Party, which is the major political force in Europe, has bought the leftist agenda. They are the party of power, but as far as the ideas are concerned, they do not have any ideas of their own. The only ideas and the only agenda they have is that provided by the European left. That's why they are on the side of so-called women's rights, or abortion, or same-sex marriage. All ideas that helped us identify the conservative parties in Europe have disappeared, such as subsidiarity, the importance of the nation state, education, family, marriage, rejection of social engineering. These were the basic concepts around which the conservative parties identified themselves and set up their agenda. Now it's all gone. They are federalists, they are internationalists, and they are they are anti-family, right? They are well for abortion and all this. So what you see in Europe is just the ideological and political hegemony of a cluster coalition of political groups, and they are advancing this politically correct agenda. That's the reason why they hate such governments as mine or Hungarian government. I mean, they really hate the conservative governments. They don't mind the communists. They don't mind the Greens, the Liberals. The communists are good guys. We are the wicked people, right? And they've been political life or political practice in Europe has become increasingly brutal. So this cartel, which has been ruling European Union, actually violates the treaties. Doesn't hesitate to violate the treaties. This hysterical assault on Poland because of the recent ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal is a case in point. I mean, it's just none of the business. I mean, the moral rulings, anything that touches upon the moral questions, is outside the competence of the European Union, but they won't have any of it. I mean, they're willing to resort to any means to punish us for this. So that shows the atmosphere of ideological hysteria and lawlessness. Some go as far as to compare this to the modern version of the Brezhnev doctrine. The Brezhnev doctrine, let me remind you, Brezhnev was the general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and the Brezhnev doctrine stated that the members of the Soviet bloc have limited sovereignty, and if they go outside the certain boundaries, then the Soviet Union is entitled to intervene militarily if it deems necessary. So nowadays, it's a modern version of the Brezhnev doctrine that the European Union, if it deems it necessary, intervene. Well, thank God, not militarily, but politically, even violating the treaties and the existing laws of the land.
Well, this is an incredibly timely argument you make, Professor. We're talking just in the wake of well, actually, as the recent spat around the budget deal and how the coalition of forces that you described as ruling Europe have pegged the so-called conditionality mechanism and to punish governments that dissent from this single ideological outlook. And I think a lot of our audience should be really shocked by the way that, as you say, these leaders are playing with the boundaries of the law, and their motivation really is ideological, as you've argued yourself in many cases. And one of those cases that I want to return to was the speech that you gave in response to Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union. That was a few weeks back, I believe in Strasbourg. You gave a very compelling, persuasive speech that argued some of these same points. But I was really interested in the description you just made of a coalescence between those who want a federal Europe, those who want to undermine the sovereignty of the nation state, and on one hand, and on the other hand, an assortment of radical causes, whether that be hyper-liberalism on social issues or green radicalism on environmental issues. And those two have come together, and they now form what you called in that speech a pincer movement. And I was really interested in that specific idea that you developed in this speech. And I wonder if, just to switch maybe to a more positive tone, what do you think the role for conservatives should be in the European Parliament for the ECR group and largely, our political family? How do you think we should be making the case that along the path that Madame von der Leyen wants us to follow along lies a Europe not united but divided, and that preserving the institutions that you've talked about and preserving the sovereignty of the nation state is actually the way to allow for pluralism and to allow for diversity of opinion. So how do you think we should be making that case in the European Parliament, for instance, and beyond?
As usual, it should be a complex strategy, not just one way to pursue. But I think we should start with making legal arguments. I think the ruling groups have become so impudent that they shamelessly violate the law, and should be indicated, and we should repeat it over and over again. Just to give an example, this conditionality thing, right? The rule of law mechanism. The legal services of European Council issued over the last years twice. They issued the opinion radically negative of this mechanism, and these documents are there. I mean, they are not easily accessible because that's the practice that you just hide things that are not convenient to you. They've been doing this, but it's there. I mean, it's a blatant assault on the treaties, and we should be outspoken about it. Now, another example is Ursula von der Leyen during the same session that you mentioned. She announced that she is going to have same-sex marriage kind of legally mandatory in the European Union. Now, this is outrageous too. I mean, it's a violation of Article 9 of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, which states explicitly that the question of family and marriage are solely the competences of nation state. I mean, these are things that are ignored or silenced, but we should be making a lot of noise about it. I mean, we should be more offensive. So that's number one. I think number two is we should have our conservative case very explicit and very open. I mean, all these, the strategy which a lot of conservatives pursued before, namely that we should try to prove that we are not as conservative as it is being imputed to us, and we are really kind of, moderate and middle of the road and cozying up to the mainstream, and deep down at heart we are liberal. No, those guys from the other side, they don't take prisoners, they don't take hostages, they expect unconditional surrender. If you do not want to wind up as Christian Democrats, German Christian Democrats, you shouldn't play games with them. I mean, if you defend family and marriage, you should do it, or we should do it openly, right? And if they call it a culture war, let it be a war. I mean, let the people in Europe see that there are two sides to the issue. We are not a different version of them. I mean, we are us, right? We are conservatives, and we represent a stronger, more humane European tradition. So we shouldn't be ashamed to represent this tradition. Now, I know it's not easy because there are not many of us, especially in the European Union. The good conservatives are hard to find, but there are some. So yeah, we should make our case very explicit and very as eloquent as possible.
Sure, and that's incredibly helpful, and we'll see how this whole the wobbly and flimsy legal mechanism that they're trying to shop through this budget deal. We'll see whether it is successful or not, and how this pans out. But these are all very important pointers, Professor, as to how we should be looking at these fights in the future. And I want to turn to your most recent book. Now that we've kind of discussed the demon in democracy and how it applies to the EU, you've got a fascinating book that is forthcoming at the beginning of next year. And I wonder if you can maybe give our audience maybe a sneak peek of what you do, what you discuss in The Cunning of Freedom, and what people can expect, what some of the themes there are that may be different from the demon in democracy.
Well, The Cunning of Freedom is more of a philosophical book, I would say, abstract. That's my re-examination of the concept of freedom. I was somehow unhappy with what I read about freedom in the books written by liberals, by even very respectable and famous liberals, such as Sir Isaiah Berlin. Actually, the whole project started a long time ago after I have read a very well-known essay by Isaiah Berlin called Two Concepts of Liberty. And the essay made a point, made an argument that there are two concepts of liberty. One is negative and the other positive. Negative meaning I am free to the extent I'm not coerced by anyone else, right? I am free to do I'm not prevented by people or by political parties or by laws to do what I want to do. Okay, it's absence of coercion. That's why it's called negative. And positive notion is that if, I'm free to the extent that I am the author of my own decision. It's me, right? Not somebody else that is the architect of what I do and say and think. And the argument in the essay was that only the first notion is the right one, the correct one, because the other notion is very dangerous. It's politically dangerous. And Berlin says, well, if somebody says, like Immanuel Kant or Plato or Socrates, that in my soul there is the higher part and the lower part, and the philosophers were saying that if the high, I'm free only insofar as the high parts, this noble part of my soul makes the decision. And Isaiah Berlin says, no, it's very dangerous, because you can imagine a political party, a church or a group or a government that will say, that will claim they represent the high part of the soul, and they may coerce me to do, and they say they will coerce me for my sake, in my own interest, because they represent what is the best in me. So it's very dangerous. And he ends his essay with actually rejecting the greatest philosophers that they ever lived, because he considered them to be dangerous to freedom. So Plato, Aristotle, Hegel, Kant, I mean, all those big guys, well, we should be very careful with them, because they are dangerous people. And I said, wait a minute, I mean, this is rubbish. I mean, what kind of freedom is it that starts with a great purge, philosophical purge? And then I can imagine all those, negative freedom fighters who will start the rule by purging not only philosophy, by purging our libraries, by purging our minds, because I'm too Platonic or too Socratic, and that's why my mind has to be recycled, right? And some good liberal stuff has to be pumped in my mind, so that I would really be a man appreciative of freedom, and then I could see these things happening all around me. I mean, those guys who are all for freedom, for negative freedom, they were carrying big sticks and they were beating us with the big stick, and they were ruining the social the social networks. They were ruining the social fabric and the moral fabric of the society. Take pornography, example. The case for pornography is strictly on the negative freedom grounds. That is, if somebody wants to produce pornography or consume pornography, let him do it or let her do it. If you do not want pornography, don't do it, don't watch it. It's a private decision. No, it's not a private decision. It's a very much public decision, because the legalizing of pornography has radically changed social morality, our sensibilities. It was a revolution. It's not a question that I won't have pornography in my own house. I'm living in a society that is has been completely transformed by pornography or abortion or things like these are the instruments of a moral revolution. And you could see those people affected by this revolution, and you asked a question: Are they really a free people? Are they those people who have been living in this change society? I mean, affected by these changes. Are they free people? Are they sovereign in their own decision? And now you discovered no, they are not. They are not sovereign. They are kind of modular people. I mean, they are the versions of the same type of existence. They reproduce the same modes of thinking, the same language. There is nothing in them that is their own, and this is this is something that a lot of people have been aware of. It's all around. So you have to be really blind and dumb not to see it. But the problem of our society is that we are all aware that we are like everybody else, and we do not want to be like everybody else. But at the same time, we use these instruments of negative freedom, and with those instruments, we want to have some or acquire some internal or positive freedom, but these instruments cannot serve this end. So you have to somehow start thinking differently about human nature, what you are, right, what your soul is, and you have to regain this positive concept of freedom, and do not be blackmailed by the champions of negative freedom. So that's roughly the starting point of the book.
And it's a fascinating book, and I'm sure that it'll be very thought provoking to a lot of your readers. And you also call for us to return to the traditional Western Greek Christian vision of human nature as being composed of the higher and the lower impulses, and the shedding away of that mental map. It has opened the way for all of the phenomena that you described. So I think people will really appreciate being re-anchored in some of the philosophical arguments that you make in the book to realize what it is that we're living through. And just to pick up on your argument that you drew there about, it seems like in liberal democracy, on the pretense of advancing a maximalist view of positive freedom, we have fail to realize that by doing that, we end up shaping public morality. And that when that happens, it becomes ever harder to dissent and to object. And so in that special way, liberal democracy ends up sidelining and silencing views that dissent from political correctness. And I want to focus on one specific case that I remember was widely covered in the United States, where in 2016, you were the victim of just precisely this phenomenon. You were across the pond, you were lecturing at, was it Middlebury College? And you were a victim of what we've now come to call woke cancellation. Your lecture was canceled by a group of students who just couldn't bear to not only engage with you, because I suppose they weren't going to be present at the lecture, but they couldn't bear to have you on their campus. Your views, they would argue, put them at risk, or some woke formula along those lines. And I wonder if, just to come back full circle to our initial conversation around political correctness and how it's also taken a hold of Europe, do you worry about episodes like those happening increasingly in the continent as well?
Oh yes, very much so. Even in my country, I'm sorry to say, it's been happening, and I'm also sorry to say that my colleagues from the academia are not particularly blameless in this respect. I mean, they are inviting these things, and they are tolerating, sometimes even encouraging. Actually, I don't know why, but the academics are the first to join all kinds of silly revolutions and the last to leave the sinking ship if it's already sinking. Well, that was also at the time of communism, or at the time of communism. Yes, I can see it even in my own country. It's usually through imitation, but it's dangerous. Until recently, I thought that we in Poland were rather safe from this because there are still professors or still people who remember about similar incidents or remember reading about similar incidents in the past after the World War II, when the communist system was imposed and all the pre-war bourgeois reactionary professors were humiliated and attacked by young communist hoodlums at the university. But well, now we kind of restaging the same thing in new liberal democratic environment. Then you see, I think what I experienced in the States, and I'm not the only one. There are many people who pass through the same experience, sometimes much more brutal than what I had to pass through. It shows many things. I think it shows the falsity of this liberal rhetoric of openness and the dialogue, right, and freedom. They say or tolerance, right? They say we are open and we are tolerant, so we won't let you speak because it will endanger, it will jeopardize this openness and tolerance that we have. So we are tolerant and you shut up, right? That's the approach. And I was wondering whether those people do not see the absurdity of the position. Apparently not. And it is easy to see why not. Because by having claimed these ideas of openness and pluralism and tolerance, they put themselves in a higher position. I mean, they are above the rest of us. I mean, the rest of those guys. And if they are above them, they can arrange the condition. I mean, they have taken the power, so they can arrange and they set up the conditions for the rest of mankind, right? And this is actually a way to exercise power. But these ideas, pluralism and tolerance, are instruments to exercise power, and it's a very big power, because they say you will have as much space as we will accord you, because we are in charge of openness and tolerance. So we will hold this much space for you, or for the time being, no space at all. And this is an immense power. We can hear this argument in the European Union. We can see it in the media. in the corporations. Our policy is the policy of openness. So there are certain conditions that have to be fulfilled, and you have no place in this, right? Unless you capitulate, you surrender, you will not have a possibility to descend. And if as you continue to descend, you will be punished. It's all for openness and plurality. So it's a very perfidious way of exercising power, but as you can see, it's extremely efficient. And the professor, the academics, who are not, as I said, very courageous people, they capitulated. So yes, it's nowadays this woke ideology is a ridiculous word, by the way, but the thing itself is extremely dangerous politically, and for the time being, I do not see, except in such countries as Poland or some other countries, I do not see that an opposing force is strong enough to contain this advent of the woke ideology.
Yeah, and I'm very glad we took the time to unpack that dynamic, that paradox of on the pretense of advancing openness and toleration, how the standard bearers of liberal democracy end up pointing a cudgel against dissenters. And I just again, to come back full circle, I wonder if we could, and this will be my exit question. We've covered an awful lot of ground, but there's one point to end on that I think will a lot of our audience will be interested in, which is, isn't this precisely what we're seeing right now with the conditionality mechanism? I mean, one of the things you yourself and others have done, but you in The Demon of Democracy, I think the American author Rod Dreher has spoken of in similar terms of how liberal democracy has a way of affecting penalties on dissenting voices, much as totalitarianism does, although perhaps not, vital threats, not the threat of, jail terms or things of that nature, but there's certainly an economic threat. There's also a threat of social disrepute, of kind of falling down the pecking order, and that was also very much the case, I believe, under communism. And I wonder if this isn't precisely what we're seeing with the European Council squabble, to the extent that essentially it seems like this has been a turning point in European integration. It is the first time where a small coalition of countries has so deliberately, so bold-facedly used financial threats to bend the policies of governments that they do not tolerate, that they think are intolerable in the EU. So just as in the way of an exit question, just to end on this note, I wonder if you could maybe give us some pointers as to how you think that the governments of Poland and Hungary should be reacting to this strategy, and what do you think specifically? What do you think this tells us about the direction of the EU? Are we? It seems like this is a turning point. Like there's no going back to a union that respects subsidiarity, that respects plurality and a diversity of outlooks across member states. So I wonder if you could maybe give us your views on that.
Yeah, the European Union seems to be resistant to any external stimuli, or doesn't draw conclusions from experience. It seems that the European Union, or the mainstream that controls the European Union, is solely motivated by enlarging their power, irrespective of the costs. The European Union has suffered several setbacks, crises, some very profound ones like Brexit, for example, or migration crisis. But nowadays we have the pandemic and the danger of economic depression and various social upheavals. And you see what the reaction is, more of the same, right? Then the torpedoes full speed ahead. And they won't be moved. People are dying, right? People are afraid of the future, and they want to punish those two dissenters, right? Those two countries. That's their priority, not the people who are dying, right? Or live in dire conditions or are afraid to find themselves living in dire conditions. No, those two villains, the Polish villain and the Hungarian villain, have to be published. You see what must be in the minds, what kind of motivation must be there. I mean, it's pathology. It's even perversion. And especially that, as I said more than once, it's completely illegal and lawless. And the sins that we have committed are nothing and compared to the sins they have been committing. In our eye is a mote, and in their eye is a beam or a huge barn, which they don't see. I mean, this is terrifying. And unless there is another deep crisis, I think they will continue this politics. Now, this conditional mechanism, which is completely illegal, if they decide to go on with it anyway, I mean, finding some other means to impose it. It means that they are able to do anything. I mean, this is the rule. This is the tyranny of the majority, and they think they can get away with anything. And if we manage to stop them, I mean, Poland and Hungary, with the tacit support of some other countries, that may be I'm not sure a turning point, but an important point to prove that they are not free to do anything they want and they can get away with anything. So I hope we will succeed. But considering the record of lawless conduct, I also take into account another scenario, a bad one. Well, we'll see. In not too distant future, we will know the answer.
Well, that's a very it depends on how you take it, but it can be a very gloomy note to end on, but also a very hopeful one. And it certainly does feel, Professor, at the specific point in the EU's process of integration, which is a 60-odd year process. It seems like just this month we've hit a turning point, a Rubicon, where on one hand we've got an ever we've got a union that endows a minority of countries to impose policies on countries they find unsavory, and on the other hand, we've got a union that preserves a certain level of subsidiarity. And we certainly hope that the effort to preserve that kind of voluntary plural union will succeed. And we're so grateful that you availed yourself for this interview this morning, Professor. And We look forward to a successful release of The Cunning of Freedom. I think folks will be really happy to read it. Remember, there's also The Demon and Democracy, which was published in 2016. And we look forward to welcoming you in the future for another episode of Rediscovering Conservatism. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.